Elijah Ward survived war bullets and shrapnel, but what he didn't expect to battle was a courtroom. All he wanted was fair housing. Instead, the system questioned his dignity. When he refused to remove the medal honoring his fallen brothers, they removed him from the witness stand. Can a judge strip away honor just because it makes the system uncomfortable? If you think some things should never be silenced, especially not courage tap, like leave your thoughts and follow our channel. Here's how it all unfolded. It was a Tuesday morning like any other in courtroom 7C. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, papers shuffled quietly, and the bailiff leaned against the wall checking his watch for the third time. No one expected much from the day's docket. Then the doors opened and everything shifted. He didn't walk in with urgency. He moved with calm, deliberate steps. A man in his 60s, tall but a little worn at the edges, carrying a plain folder in one hand. His name was Elijah Ward. Black, 64 years old, a former staff sergeant who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Kandahar, 2004, wounded by shrapnel. The limp in his right leg wasn't exaggerated, but it never left him. He wore a dark blazer, simple, modest, but on his chest, just above the heart, was a Purple Heart medal. Not polished for show, not hung around his neck. It was pinned to the fabric like it had always belonged there, like it wasn't decoration, but declaration. Elijah didn't enter to be seen. He entered because he had something to say. He was here not for honor, not for ceremony. He was suing the Claremont Veterans Housing Authority for denying him access to a low-income housing program. They claimed that while his disability was service-connected, it didn't meet their updated hardship threshold. Too stable, not disabled enough, not quite broken in the way they could file and accept. He took his seat in the front near the witness stand. He didn't look around. He didn't sigh. He simply sat upright and still with the medal catching light just so. No lawyer sat beside him, no family member behind. Just the man, the folder, and the weight of what brought him here. Judge Martin Coldwell sat behind the bench. In his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed beard and a permanent frown etched across his face, he glanced up when Elijah entered. Coldwell was a man of rules, sharp on procedure, cold on compassion. For years, he had built a reputation on courtroom decorum and impartiality, but those who paid attention knew his pattern. He favored order more than fairness, especially when it came to veterans who didn't look like him. At the prosecutor's table sat Assistant District Attorney Deborah Glass. White, mid-30s, precise in posture and speech. Her suit was immaculate. Her tone when she spoke was measured to the syllable. She believed in law as structure, not sentiment. She saw cases, not people. Elijah's file sat before her unopened. In the last row, a young law student named Rachel Lee watched the room shift. 23 years old Korean-American third-year intern assigned to observe court proceedings. She had been bored for weeks until now. When Elijah walked in, something in the space changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quieter than that. The air just felt heavier, more honest. Rachel didn't know who he was yet, but she lifted her phone and tapped record, sensing this moment might matter. What she captured over the next hour would spread far beyond the courtroom. But no one in the room knew that yet. Not the judge, not the prosecutor, not even Elijah. Because before a single word was spoken, before the case was called, something deeper had already taken place. The presence of that medal pinned above Elijah Ward's heart was saying something the room wasn't ready to hear. While others were preparing motions and objections, he had already delivered his message. I served. I bled. I watched others die. And now you tell me I don't qualify for shelter. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just sat composed and unshaken, carrying a truth too heavy to be removed. No one said a word. But somehow, without warning or permission, the silence in courtroom 7C had already taken sides. The case was called without ceremony. Just a name docket number and the clearing of a throat. Elijah stood slowly and made his way to the witness stand. His steps were steady, deliberate, each one echoing louder than it should have in that narrow courtroom. He placed his hand on the Bible, raised the other, and took the oath without a blink. He didn't adjust his blazer. He didn't brush the metal, he just waited. Judge Coldwell watched him with that familiar half-squint he reserved for things he didn't particularly want to deal with. He didn't speak right away. He folded his hands, looked down at the file, then looked back up. "Mr. Ward," he said, his voice clipped and flat. "Before we proceed, I need to address an issue of courtroom decorum." Elijah didn't move, he simply waited. Coldwell cleared his throat again, this time more pointed. "That medal on your jacket. The court does not permit symbols, political or military, to be displayed during active testimony. This is not a military proceeding. It is a civil hearing. You'll need to remove it." There was no immediate reaction. Not from Elijah, not from the room. For a second, it was as if no one had heard him. But the silence stretched just long enough to turn sharp. Elijah's eyes didn't flinch. His voice came low, calm, but clear. "I don't wear this medal for show," he said. "I wear it for the ones who didn't come back." Coldwell blinked almost imperceptibly. "That may be, but rules are rules. No exceptions. No personal insignia. Remove it, or we will postpone this hearing until you can comply." From the prosecution table, Deborah Glass shifted forward, her tone clipped and neutral. "Your Honor, the court's neutrality is vital. Emotional symbols can bias the record. We must protect the process." Elijah turned toward her, but only slightly. He didn't speak to her. He didn't need to. He stepped an inch closer to the microphone, not to raise his voice, but to make sure it carried. "I earned this in Kandahar. The piece of metal you see pinned to my chest was pulled from it too. I wear it because half the men who should have worn one never lived long enough to see it. I wear it because it reminds me every day what I owe them. And I won't take it off, not here, not anywhere." A few seats back, someone inhaled sharply. The gallery remained silent, but the tension shifted. It was no longer formality. It was something heavier. It was defiance, yes, but not of the law, of the refusal to see a man whole. Judge Coldwell's lips thinned. His jaw tightened. "Bailiff," he said. Ron Parker stepped forward. A large man, late 40s, white eyes already cast with the kind of disapproval that doesn't need words. He stood beside Elijah, close, too close. His hand didn't touch the veteran, but it hovered just enough to send a message. "Elijah Ward, you're being asked to leave the stand until you comply with the court's instructions," Coldwell said without emotion. Elijah didn't respond. He didn't nod. He simply stood still, looking straight ahead. The bailiff leaned in, his voice low enough for only one man to hear it. "Men like you," he muttered, "ought to know when to keep quiet." Elijah turned then slowly. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes didn't blink. He looked Ron Parker directly in the face, held the gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, and then turned toward the courtroom doors. No one said a word as he walked out. Not the judge, not the prosecutor, not even Rachel, though her phone never left his frame. The doors closed behind him with a sound that felt louder than it should have. It wasn't dramatic. It was final. And yet it felt like something had only just begun. Inside, Judge Coldwell adjusted his robe as if trying to brush something invisible off his lap. Deborah Glass reorganized her notes, her hands a little tighter than before. But in the back row, Rachel Lee sat perfectly still. Her phone screen now black, her heart hammering. She didn't yet know the weight of what she had recorded, but she knew this much. That wasn't the end of anything. That was the start of something none of them were ready for. It wasn't the kind of video that usually goes viral. There were no loud voices, no shouting, no shaky camera work or shocking twists. Just a man standing still, his chest bearing a medal that spoke louder than any argument, and a bailiff leaning in with a presence that didn't need words to feel threatening. 54 seconds. That was the entire clip. Rachel Lee uploaded it that afternoon with barely a caption. She didn't add a call to action. She didn't add her opinion. She didn't need to. The image was enough. By nightfall, the views had crossed 1 million. By dawn, 5. The footage was reposted by veterans groups, picked up by advocacy pages, clipped into a quiet montage by a Gold Star mother who included her son's flag-folding ceremony. A retired Marine sergeant wrote just one sentence above the clip. "This is not about a courtroom. This is about memory." A hashtag began to appear under the video, short and clear. "Let him wear it." By morning, it was everywhere. On news tickers, local broadcasts, church bulletins, school group chats, and veteran forums. Radio hosts discussed it between traffic reports. A pastor in Georgia quoted it in his Sunday sermon. A social worker in Minneapolis taped the words across her office door. But while the nation found its voice, Elijah Ward said nothing. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't post a statement. He didn't speak to reporters. He didn't even leave a voicemail for the one friend who tried reaching him. He just went home. His apartment sat above a weathered garage at the edge of Claremont. There was no front porch, no flower beds, only a dented mailbox, and a door that stuck in the frame if pulled too hard. Inside was a single room. One table, one chair, a bookshelf with worn spines, and a wall with a photo that had faded from sunlight and time. 3 men in uniform stood in the picture, young and smiling. Dust covered their boots. One of them was Elijah. The other 2 hadn't made it home. He removed his blazer, folded it neatly, and hung it beside the door. Then he unpinned the Purple Heart and laid it flat on the kitchen table the way someone might place a memory they weren't ready to let go of. He poured himself a cup of coffee. No cream, no sugar, just the bitterness he'd grown to expect. Then he sat down, opened a pocket-sized copy of the Constitution, and began to read. Not for inspiration, not for drama. He did it the way someone might return to a hymn they've heard all their life, not because they doubt it, but because they need to remember it still belongs to them. The phone rang once around 9. He let it ring. It rang again just past noon. He didn't move. It rang a 3rd time at dusk, just as the last light was fading behind the rooftops. This time he answered. He didn't recognize the number, but the voice on the other end didn't need introduction. Elijah, it said, deep and measured, familiar in the way only certain voices from your past can be. Took me long enough to find your number. Still avoiding phones. Elijah allowed a quiet breath through his nose, something close to a smile, but not quite. I don't avoid them, he said. I just don't chase them. The voice exhaled. Not a laugh. More like a memory being released. Well, it said you might want to keep it close. This thing, it's not going away. There was a pause, then a tone shift. Firmer. Personal. Elijah. I'll be outside that courthouse tomorrow morning. Full dress. I'll be standing beside you if you'll let me. Elijah didn't respond right away. His eyes drifted to the medal on the table, then to the photo on the wall. For a moment, he let the silence settle. You still wear that old West Point ring, he asked. Doesn't come off easy. Neither does mine. There were no goodbyes. None were needed. Elijah rinsed his mug and reached for his blazer. He ran his fingers gently across the lapel, stopping at the place where the medal had rested all morning. Then he picked it up and pinned it back on, slow and exact. Outside, the world was buzzing with headlines and hashtags. But inside that small, silent room, nothing had changed. He had not spoken loudly. He had not marched. He had not demanded a thing. He had simply refused to erase the truth. And somehow that silence had begun to shake the country awake. The next morning, the courthouse stood quiet. No protests, no flashing cameras, no chants on the steps. Just a sky colored in early gray and a soft wind brushing across the concrete. Inside, the silence was different. Not empty, not sterile. It felt expectant. Elijah Ward entered just after 8. Same blazer, same medal. No security escort, no legal counsel, no news crew. He carried no papers. He didn't glance around. He walked the hallway like he had done it before, not because he had to, but because it was his to walk. Courtroom 7C was already half full, not with reporters, not with clerks, but with men and women who had spent their lives in uniforms and boots on bases and battlegrounds in silence and in service. Some wore ribbons, some wore scars, all wore something that didn't need to be said aloud. Elijah stepped in without hesitation and took the same seat he had occupied 2 days earlier. He didn't look behind him. He didn't need to. Then one man stood. He was in his 70s, lean silver hair combed back, his dark green jacket, a size too big now. He walked toward Elijah slowly without drama and placed his hand gently on the veteran's shoulder. 3 seconds. No words, just presence. Then he returned to his seat. A moment passed. Another figure rose. A woman this time mid-60s, compact and upright. She wore a dark navy skirt suit, a bronze star ribbon on her lapel. She made her way forward and rested her hand on Elijah's shoulder, steady, warm. "You're not standing alone," she whispered. Then she walked back. They continued, one by one, quietly, without prompt or coordination. Each one stepped forward, paused behind Elijah, placed a hand on his shoulder for 3 seconds, then returned to their seat. One man knelt beside him briefly, voice soft and cracked. "My brother didn't make it out of Ramadi. You're carrying both of you today. No cameras captured it. No one took out a phone." The room itself seemed to breathe differently, as if the silence had learned how to speak. Some stayed silent. Others whispered a name or a memory or a simple word of thanks. But no one stayed seated out of fear. They rose because something in them recognized what Elijah had done. Not the lawsuit, not the medal, but the decision to stay seated and stay true even when it would have been easier to stand down. Rachel Lee sat in this back phone in her lap, untouched. She didn't record a second of it. Her eyes didn't leave the front of the room. She wasn't afraid of missing a moment. She was afraid of missing the meaning. After the 12th veteran returned to their seat, the room felt heavier. Not burdened, but filled. Like something sacred had begun and no one dared interrupt it. Then the doors opened again, and in walked General Marcus Ellison. His dress uniform was impeccable. Silver trim, chest full of ribbons, boots, polished to mirror. He didn't break stride. He didn't look left or right. His eyes stayed fixed on Elijah. He walked past the gallery, past the prosecution's table, and stopped beside the seated veteran. He didn't offer a salute. He didn't speak. He reached to his own jacket, unpinned his medal, an old Distinguished Service Cross dulled by time, and held it for a second in his hand. Then he leaned forward and pinned it carefully beside Elijah's Purple Heart. Still no words. Then he stepped back and stood silent at Elijah's side. The courtroom had no air left to move. The gallery, the clerk, the guards, everyone remained frozen. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Rachel didn't blink. Elijah didn't turn. He didn't need to. Every hand that had touched his shoulder, every whisper, every step, had already told him what mattered. They weren't there to fight the court. They were there to remind it what it had forgotten. That honor doesn't ask permission. That silence doesn't mean surrender. That sometimes the loudest act of resistance is to sit and refuse to be moved. No one said so out loud, but in that room it was already known. The law hadn't been rewritten, but the atmosphere had. It didn't feel like a hearing anymore. It felt like a reckoning. Not loud, not violent, just patient and precise. And in that quiet procession, in every hand placed on one man's shoulder, something deeper had been passed along. A promise, a witness, a vow without words. The court hadn't even begun, but the message had already been delivered. And in that stillness, the next storm was quietly gathering. When the judge finally entered, the air in courtroom 7C was no longer the same. It wasn't just the number of people or the rows of medals now quietly watching from the gallery. It was the weight of what had just passed through the room. Something solemn, something already larger than procedure. Judge Coldwell moved with the same rigid posture, but his eyes scanned faster than usual. He saw the uniforms, the shoulders squared, the Distinguished Service Cross gleaming beside the Purple Heart. He saw General Ellison standing tall next to Elijah, his presence steady and unreadable. But the judge said nothing about it. He took his seat, tapped the gavel once, cleared his throat. This court does not operate on sentiment. We are not here to perform for cameras or for comfort. I will not be pressured into abandoning courtroom standards for the sake of public theater. The room stayed still. No one raised their voice. No one challenged him. But the silence had a temperature to it now, and it wasn't cold. Ellison shifted, not forward, not aggressive, just enough for his voice to carry. "I didn't come for theater, Your Honor. And I didn't wear this medal so you'd notice me. I wore it because some men died earning theirs. I wore it because this room forgot that." Coldwell's jaw moved, slightly. He looked down, then back up. That medal and all others remain a distraction in this proceeding. The courtroom didn't react. No murmurs, no gasps. Only the sound of a breath held a moment too long. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't move. But something in his face changed. A shift so small it would have gone unnoticed if Rachel hadn't been watching him the whole time. It wasn't defeat, not exactly. Just a weight, a tiredness that doesn't come from the body. He looked down at the table. His hand rested near the edge, still and quiet. For a moment it looked like he might stand, like he might gather his things and walk out. And then a voice spoke. It was small, soft, high but sure. "Are you the one who keeps the promise?" It came from the last row, barely above a whisper. Everyone turned slightly, but no one more than Elijah. At the far end of the gallery, feet barely touching the floor, sat a little black girl, no more than 7 or 8. Hair tied back, a neat dress. Her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes locked on Elijah's with a seriousness far beyond her years. He didn't answer right away. She didn't flinch. "You are right. You're the one who doesn't let people forget." The courtroom held its breath. Elijah turned to face her more fully. His back straightened slightly. His shoulders drew back. He looked into her eyes like they were speaking the same language only the two of them could understand. Then he nodded. Once. No smile, no words, just a nod that carried everything. The girl smiled just a little. Not wide, not dramatic, but real. Then she looked down at her hands again, and the room stayed quiet. Coldwell shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable with the stillness he could no longer control. He reached for the docket, shuffled pages, cleared his throat again. But no one was listening anymore. The court had moved on without him, and Elijah, still seated, no longer looked like a man exhausted by resistance. He looked like a man who remembered why he had stayed. Not for the judge, not for the court, but for someone watching, for someone learning what it looks like to carry dignity even when no one makes room for it. Outside, the sky had begun to brighten. Light filtered through the high windows, softening the edges of the wooden benches, casting long shadows behind the gallery. Rachel looked down at her phone. She still hadn't recorded anything. She didn't need to. Because sometimes it's not about catching the moment. Sometimes it's about witnessing it. And what she had just seen wasn't an argument or a performance. It was a passing of something sacred, a promise made in silence, and kept in full view. For a long time, Elijah didn't move. The courtroom had returned to silence, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Even the sound of papers turning seemed too loud now. No one whispered. No one dared to break the stillness that had wrapped around the room like something sacred. Then Elijah stood. He didn't rush. He didn't glance at the judge. He walked slowly toward the witness stand, but instead of taking a seat, he stopped just in front of it. One hand reached into his inside pocket. What he pulled out was not a legal document, not a prepared speech. It was a small black envelope. He placed it on the edge of the witness stand. The gesture was so quiet, so understated, it took a few seconds for people to even notice he had done it. But once they did, no one could look away. "This is not a statement," he said. "Not in words, not in politics. Just truth." He opened the envelope and removed what was inside. It was a Purple Heart, not his. The room froze. "This medal," Elijah said slowly, "was awarded posthumously to Staff Sergeant Otis Rawlings, United States Army. Killed in action, Kandahar Province, 2004. There was a pause, not long, but heavy. Otis stepped in front of a grenade so I could be the one standing here today. He looked down at the medal in his hand, his thumb brushing the edge of it as if remembering not just the man, but the exact weight of the moment it was earned. When I wear mine, I wear his too, because he didn't get the chance. And because every day I wake up breathing, I remember what it cost." He lifted his gaze now directly at the bench. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "So if you're asking me to take this off, then you'd better be ready to give back the life I'm carrying it for." Silence. Not the kind that comes from tension. The kind that comes when something true is said so plainly, it strips away every defense. Judge Coldwell didn't blink. His jaw tightened. His hand hovered near the edge of the bench, as if unsure whether to speak or stay still. His eyes flicked toward the clerk, then the bailiff, then back to Elijah. But before he could open his mouth, a voice came from the gallery. "I know that name." Everyone turned. A woman had risen from her seat near the back, mid-60s, face drawn but strong. She clutched a small leather bag in her hands, her knuckles pale from pressure. "Otis Rawlings is my son." She didn't shout it. She didn't need to. The way she said it made the words feel like they had always belonged to the room, just waiting for the right moment to arrive. "I sent him care packages every week," she said. "He never told me the details. Said it was better that way. But I knew. I always knew he'd end up protecting someone else before himself." She walked slowly down the aisle. Her steps measured shoulders upright. When she reached the front, she didn't speak again right away. She looked at the medal in Elijah's hand, then at the one pinned to his chest. "You don't take that off," she said. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. Her voice was steady but full. "You don't ever take that off." Elijah lowered his head just slightly, then placed the second Purple Heart back into the envelope and laid it on the edge of the stand once more. "For him," he said, For every step I got to take that he didn't. Rachel's throat tightened. She didn't know Otis. She didn't know Elijah until 3 days ago. But right now she felt like she was watching something sacred unfold. Like she was standing in a space that had stopped belonging to law and started belonging to memory. The judge still hadn't spoken. Because what do you say to a man who carries another man's last breath? What do you say when the mother stands to say your rule book doesn't hold her son? There was no ruling made that morning. No gavel dropped. No procedural language recorded. But something in the room shifted. The court had been trying to weigh medals against rules, sacrifice against codes. Now it had to reckon with something else entirely. A life. And the man who refused to forget it. The truth didn't come with headlines or speeches. It came quietly, 1 page at a time. Rachel Lee wasn't looking for anything more than context when she returned to the courthouse library that afternoon. But something inside her wouldn't let go of what she'd witnessed. That second medal. The mother's voice. The way the air had shifted after Elijah stood at the witness stand. She hadn't known it then, but something had already begun to unravel. She started with the case files. Veteran housing rejections. Filtered by race. Then filtered again by judge. The pattern came slowly then, all at once. 12 rulings, all signed by Judge Martin Coldwell, all involving black veterans, all denied based on technicalities that felt more like traps than rules. Some were missing a stamp. Others were filed 1 day late. A few were dismissed because the applicant failed to attend an orientation that had never been scheduled. On paper, they looked like procedural issues, but lined up side by side, they looked like design. Rachel didn't trust her conclusion. Not yet. So she took the files to someone who knew how to read between the lines. Nia Salgado had spent the better part of a year digging into discrepancies in the city's veteran housing program. As a reporter for the Claremont Post, she'd chased bureaucratic dust trails through policy memos and agency budgets, but she had never found the pattern that made it all stick. Until now. Rachel handed her the stack without saying a word. Nia flipped through the first 3, then paused. "I've seen this before," she said. "I just didn't have the names." By the end of the day, Nia had the names and something else. A directive from the housing department dated 3 years earlier signed by Deputy Director Travis Hemsworth. It outlined internal adjustments to how housing cases were prioritized. In the fine print was the phrase that made her sit up straighter. Deprioritize cases involving veterans of color with non-visible disabilities. The justification had been buried in funding formulas language about capacity limits and projected risk scores. But the message was clear. Some people were meant to wait longer. Some people were never meant to be seen. That memo wasn't a loophole. It was policy. Back in courtroom 7C, none of that had been said aloud. The judge was still seated, the docket still untouched. Elijah remained silent. But something beneath the surface had shifted. Because now the question wasn't about one man's medal. It was about a structure. A system that had learned how to say no without ever raising its voice. Then, just before the recess, another man entered the courtroom. He came in without sound. No one turned. No one noticed at first. He wore a faded jacket. Carried a worn folder. Sat in the very last row, close to the exit. His shoulders were slightly hunched, like someone who'd grown used to not taking up space. Rachel noticed him first. He opened the folder slowly, carefully, like it held something fragile. Inside were 5 letters neatly stacked. All rejections, all stamped with different reasons. Application incomplete. Eligibility unclear. Program at capacity. He read them again and again as if trying to convince himself the words hadn't changed overnight. Elijah turned slightly, just enough to see the man's face. They didn't speak, but their eyes met. And for a moment, they weren't strangers. They were witnesses to the same truth. The man's name was Alvin Knox, 81 years old, Vietnam veteran. 2 tours. Diagnosed with PTSD 3 decades ago. He had applied for veteran housing 4 times in the last 6 years, every application denied. No hearings, no explanations, just silence. Now he sat at the edge of the room, not for justice, not even for hope. He came to see if maybe this time someone else might not be turned away. He didn't cry. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't move. But his presence said more than any filing ever could. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't one bad judge. This was a system built layer by layer that had quietly closed its doors on the very people it promised to protect. And now, for the first time, the doors were being pushed open. Because injustice spoken aloud is one thing, But injustice witnessed in silence is something else entirely, and that silence had just begun to break. Inside courtroom 7C, the silence was still intact. Nothing seemed to move. The judge's bench remained empty. The gallery sat in quiet rows like rows of breathing monuments. No one spoke. No one shifted. The atmosphere held its breath. But outside these walls, the country was no longer quiet. The night before, Nia Salgado had uploaded her report. Not just a clip or a headline, but the full story. Elijah's refusal, the second medal, the mother who stood, and the pattern of denials buried deep inside a broken housing system. Her voice was calm, but the facts were relentless. And by morning, 20 million people had already watched. On Twitter, the hashtags rose like a storm swell. Respect the medal. This is why we serve. Veterans are watching. Across platforms, across states, across political lines, the response was immediate. Not trending, not viral. Uprising. It wasn't just civilians. It was soldiers, families, retired generals, Gold Star mothers, paralyzed Marines, nurses who had served in Vietnam, teachers who had buried their brothers, bus drivers who still wore their dog tags. And they weren't posting out of rage. They were posting out of memory. One image showed a child holding his grandfather's Purple Heart in a trembling hand, captioned only with the words, "He earned it." They questioned it. By sunrise, over 100 veteran organizations had signed a joint petition addressed to the Department of Veterans Affairs and the State Attorney General. Gold Star families launched a parallel statement. Their demand was clear: immediate protection for military honors inside all state courts. No more removals, no more erasures, no more silence. The pressure hit fast. By mid-morning, the governor's office was fielding calls from across the country. Congressional aides reached out behind the scenes. Morning shows opened with Elijah's name. The video had reached the White House briefing desk. But the action didn't come from Washington. It came from Claremont. The State Department of Justice and the local Veterans Affairs Division met behind closed doors. By 10:42, a joint emergency directive was drafted, reviewed, and signed. It declared that all official military honors awarded by the United States government were to be recognized as legally protected symbols in every courtroom across the state. Civil, criminal, no exceptions. And none of that had yet reached Elijah Ward, who sat quietly near the front of courtroom 7C, eyes forward posture. Still the Purple Heart unmoved on his chest. At exactly 11 o'clock, Judge Martin Coldwell stepped through the side entrance. He walked to the bench without looking at the gallery. His face was composed. His hands rested on the edge of the bench as if nothing outside the walls had changed. The moment he opened his mouth to begin, the door at the back of the courtroom swung open. A clerk entered briskly holding a sealed envelope. She crossed the room with purpose and handed it directly to the court officer. He read it quickly, nodded once, and stepped toward the bench. "Your Honor, this is an emergency communication from the Office of the State Attorney General and the Department of Veterans Affairs. It requires immediate attention." Coldwell didn't reach for it right away. His fingers drummed slightly on the bench. The court officer waited, then placed the document on the wood in front of him and stepped back. The judge opened it slowly. He scanned the text once, then again. His expression hardened. "This court is not governed by social sentiment," he said sharply. "We do not bow to trending outrage or political theater." No one responded. But he knew. The room had already turned. He cleared his throat and tried again. "We will proceed under the authority of law, not public opinion." Still no response, just rows of eyes steady and waiting. He looked toward Elijah, who hadn't moved. Not a word. Not a blink. General Ellison remained seated beside him. Uniform pristine, arms crossed. Behind them, veterans, students, mothers, lawyers, and clerks sat shoulder to shoulder, not chanting, not protesting. Just watching. The judge adjusted his glasses. This court reserves the right to interpret what constitutes acceptable conduct and appearance. But the clerk interrupted, her voice even. "The directive has already been countersigned, Your Honor. It is binding, statewide." Coldwell stared at her, then looked again at the paper in his hands. Something in his jaw shifted, then set. "Very well," he said finally. "Then let the record reflect that this proceeding continues under protest." But no one was writing it down, because no one was listening to him anymore. Inside courtroom 7C, silence still ruled. The judge's bench sat empty. The walls echoed with nothing but breath. No one whispered. No one shifted. It was the kind of quiet that settles when everyone knows the next sound might change everything. But outside, the country was making noise. The night before, Nia Salgado published her full report. No filters, no edits. Just truth. It opened with the image of Elijah standing at the witness stand holding a second medal that wasn't his, telling the story of a man who had died so he could live. It moved through the names of the 12 denied veterans, the government memo buried in bureaucracy, and the mother who stood for her fallen son. Within hours, the video swept across the country. By dawn, over 20 million people had watched it. Online, the hashtags rose like tides. Respect the medal. This is why we serve. Veterans are watching. They came from every direction. From young veterans in dorm rooms to aging Marines in assisted living centers. From school teachers, from surgeons, from farmhands, from pilots, from prison guards. And none of it was performance. It was remembrance. Photos flooded in. Purple hearts on jackets pinned beside old wounds. Bronze stars in shadow boxes. Folded flags on mantles. Men and women holding medals they didn't ask for, earned in deserts and jungles and skies, asking a question no court had answered yet. If these honors mean nothing here, then what do they mean at all? By sunrise, over 100 veteran service organizations had signed a formal petition to the State Attorney General and the Department of Veterans Affairs. Gold Star families launched a parallel campaign. Their request was urgent but simple. Protect the symbols. Protect the memory. Protect the right to carry sacrifice without permission. The pressure hit fast. By mid-morning, the governor's office was flooded with calls. State senators issued statements. Congressional aides reached out for clarifications, and the video had reached the White House. But the first true response came not from Washington, but from within the state. At 10:42, the Department of Justice and the State Veterans Affairs Office signed a joint emergency directive. Effective immediately, all military honors awarded by the United States government would be legally recognized in every courtroom across the state, civil or criminal, local or federal. No court, no judge, no dress code could override them again. None of this had reached Elijah. He sat near the front of the courtroom just as he had before. His hands were still, his posture calm, the medal on his chest unmoved. He didn't check the time. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The weight of the room had changed, but his reason for being there had not. At 11 o'clock sharp, Judge Martin Coldwell entered the courtroom. He walked to the bench without acknowledging the gallery. His face held steady. He adjusted his robe, took a breath, then lifted his hand to begin. He didn't get the chance. The courtroom door opened once more. A court officer entered, walking quickly toward the bench. In his hand was a sealed envelope. He handed it to the clerk, who read the header, paused, and turned to face the judge. Your Honor, this is a certified communication from the Office of the State Attorney General and the Department of Veterans Affairs. It is marked urgent and binding. Coldwell narrowed his eyes. He didn't reach for the letter. Instead, he placed both palms on the bench and leaned forward. This court is not governed by headlines or hashtags, he said. We do not yield to performance or public pressure. Law must remain law even when sentiment rises around it. The clerk remained still. Sir, she said quietly, this directive is legal. It has been entered into the record by executive authority. He opened the envelope slowly. His lips tightened as he read. His jaw moved once, then stilled. Very well, he said. Then let the record reflect that this court proceeds under protest. No one spoke, but the shift in the room was unmistakable. Not a gasp, not a cheer, just stillness. Not defiance, not victory. Just a quiet awareness that something irreversible had occurred. Elijah didn't move. His eyes remained fixed ahead. General Ellison sat beside him, composed. Behind them, a room full of veterans and civilians sat in calm silence. No one spoke. No one needed to. Because for the first time in that room, the authority no longer sat at the bench. It sat in memory. It sat in sacrifice. And it sat in every person who finally looked up and remembered what they were supposed to be defending in the first place. Judge Coldwell sat rigid at the bench, hands clasped as if holding something together. His voice, when it returned, was steady but thinner now. He spoke of procedure, of order, of the court's need to proceed with dignity. But in truth, the room had already moved on without him. It wasn't loud, it wasn't unruly, but it had changed. No one leaned forward to catch his next word. No one watched him with the same reverence as before. The silence in the room had shape now, not one molded by authority, but by memory. It no longer belonged to the man behind the bench. It belonged to the people seated in front of it. He cleared his throat, adjusted the docket, tried again. "We will resume with," but he didn't finish. A young man in the second row stood. Mid-30s, plain navy coat, a single veteran's pin on his chest. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask to speak. He simply did. "You can issue a ruling today, sir." But the verdict was already delivered by the people. He sat back down just as calmly. No applause followed, no camera flashes, just stillness, and a truth that hung in the room long after he had spoken. Moments later, the double doors at the back opened once more. 5 law students entered, walking in quiet formation. Each carried a bound copy of the Constitution held with both hands. They made their way slowly to the front, eyes forward, solemn. When they reached the bench, they placed a copy on the floor below it, then turned and returned to their seats. They never said a word. They didn't have to. The message was carved into the air around them. Law means nothing if it forgets who it was meant to protect. Judge Coldwell blinked. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He glanced at the copies of the Constitution, then at the gallery. And finally, his eyes landed on a familiar face. Rachel Lee. She hadn't expected to be called forward, but someone whispered her name to the clerk. The room seemed to hold its breath as she rose and stepped toward the center. "I came here to observe how the law works," she said quietly. "I thought I'd be writing about precedent and procedure. But what I witnessed was deeper than that. I saw a courtroom trying to remember what dignity looks like, and I saw people refusing to let silence be mistaken for consent." She offered a small nod and returned to her seat. Her words lingered like a question unanswered. Coldwell shifted. He tapped the stack of papers in front of him, then stood. "This proceeding is hereby suspended due to persistent disruption and a failure to maintain courtroom decorum. We will reconvene when order can be restored." He stepped down from the bench, but the robe no longer carried its weight. No one rose when he passed. No one acknowledged his departure. He walked through the side door and vanished into the hallway, leaving the courtroom exactly as he had found it. Except this time it was no longer his. No one left. The people remained seated. Some bowed their heads. Others simply waited. And then, slowly from the back of the room, an older man stood. He wore a weathered army jacket, the kind with patches that told stories you didn't ask about unless you were ready to listen. His walk was slow, deliberate. He passed by rows of strangers who nodded as he moved. When he reached the bench, he paused. Then he stepped up and sat, not in defiance, not in ceremony, just in presence. His hands rested on his knees. His eyes swept the room. He looked like someone who had seen enough to know when silence carried more truth than declarations. "This seat," he said gently, "was never meant to lift anyone above the rest. It was built to remind us of the people we forget." And just like that, the courtroom found its balance again. There was no gavel, no oath, no ruling, but something had been restored, not justice by statute, but remembrance by community. They had not come to win. They had come to stand witness. And in doing so, they had reclaimed something the bench had forgotten. That power without conscience is nothing. And dignity once revealed cannot be ruled out of order. That afternoon, no ruling was recorded. No closing arguments, no judgment filed. Because the real verdict had already been rendered, and everyone in that room had heard it, even if it was never spoken aloud. 1 week after the courtroom fell quiet, Judge Martin Coldwell submitted his request for an indefinite leave of absence. There was no statement, no interview, just a formal letter filed through official channels and a quiet withdrawal from public life. The Judicial Ethics Committee confirmed that an investigation was underway, but by then most people had already made up their minds. No one gathered outside to protest. No one cheered, because the focus had shifted. Something more important was happening. On the courthouse lawn, just beneath the windows of courtroom 7C, a small wooden bench had been installed. It wasn't part of any official plan. It had no plaque from the city. It had been built by volunteers, some veterans, some students, some who had simply passed by and decided to stay and help. It was made of pine, smooth and unstained, with a hand-painted sign across the backrest. The People's Bench. It wasn't a place for verdicts, it was a place for memory. That morning, a quiet crowd began to gather. No one carried signs. No one raised voices. They came in pairs, in families, in silence. Some wore uniforms. Some wore medals. Some brought nothing but themselves. They stood beneath the early sun, circling the bench the way people do around something sacred. Elijah had been invited to speak. He arrived early and stood at a distance, his jacket buttoned neatly, the Purple Heart resting in its usual place over his heart. When they handed him the microphone, he didn't take it. Instead, he walked slowly to the bench, placed his hand gently over the medal pinned to his chest, and stood still for a moment. Then he turned and walked away. There was no applause, only understanding. At the far end of the lawn, under the shade of a maple tree, Alvin Knox sat holding a manila envelope. He wore a pressed shirt, his hands folded in his lap. Inside the envelope was a letter his housing application had finally been approved. Attached to it was a single handwritten note clipped to the corner. "You should have never had to ask this many times." He read it once, closed the folder with care, and held it against his chest like something he wasn't ready to put down just yet. Nearby workers were finishing the installation of a new memorial. It was simple. A low, curved wall of stone set against the grass. In its center stood a bronze replica of the Purple Heart, mounted upright on a granite base. The inscription beneath it was quiet but resolute. For those who wore the wound and those who wore the silence, people lined up to stand before it. Some bowed their heads. Others just looked. A child on her father's shoulders pointed to the medal. A woman placed her palm over her heart. No one spoke. But the stillness was full, like a breath being held not out of fear but reverence. Then, as if drawn by memory, a little girl walked to the wooden bench. She was small, no older than 7, wearing a light sweater and sneakers that scuffed softly against the stone path. In her hand was a single white flower. She approached the bench, paused, and placed the flower gently on the corner of the seat. She turned slowly. Elijah was watching from beneath a tree not far away. Their eyes met across the space between them. She called out, "Is this your bench now?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the flower, then at her, then at the people gathered nearby. "No," he said softly. "It's yours." She nodded once like she understood. He stayed a moment longer, watching her return to her family. Then he turned and walked quietly back into the crowd. That evening, as the courthouse lights dimmed and the lawn emptied, the bench remained. The flower stayed where she had left it. And the bronze heart on the memorial caught the last edge of sunlight before the sky faded into blue. There was no music, no speech, only the echo of something quiet that had settled into the ground and would not be moved. Back in his apartment, Elijah boiled water for tea. He fed his dog, adjusted the blinds, and placed his jacket carefully on the brass hook beside the door. The medal stayed pinned above the heart, still and shining. Next to it, taped to the wall, was a small handwritten note. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were clear. "You didn't raise your voice, you didn't back down, you didn't win a case. You reminded a nation how to carry its memory." He read it once, then reached to turn off the light. And out across the country, on courthouse steps, in school auditoriums, at kitchen tables and quiet porches, veterans who had long removed their medals before entering public buildings began to wear them again. Not for recognition, not for display, but to be seen. To make sure that those who never came home were not forgotten. Not by the law, not by the silence, not by the children who would sit one day on a bench, made not of power, but of remembrance. Some stories don't end with applause. They end with a quiet nod, a flower on a bench, a medal left shining. This was never just about a courtroom. It was about dignity long denied, but never lost. About a man who chose silence over spectacle. About a nation that looked away for too long, then finally looked up. It's about memory, carried not in headlines, but in hearts. If this story moved you, we invite you to do something simple, but meaningful. Tap the like button. Share this story with someone who still believes in quiet courage. And subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories, where we honor the voices history almost forgot. Every bit of support you give helps our small team keep telling stories like this. Stories that don't just entertain, but remind. Remind us who we are, who we've overlooked, and what we must never forget. Because here at Mr. Max, we believe in one thing above all: memory is justice whispered and remembered. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story.